This is the John Batchelor Show. Rich Lowry's here, and he's in and out of his time machine because he's looking at Abraham Lincoln, not the saint Abraham Lincoln, but the very ambitious man, a man who embraced success and appreciated it. It made him happy. It made his wife happy. It was also, of course, his fate that success led him to the tragedy of his assassination. But that is not the whole story. The whole story is what we can say now about Lincoln in the 21st century. Rich, let's speak harshly of the welfare state, because that is a creation. You mentioned the 1930s. I'm going to say 1965 and the beginning of the Great Society, especially the great big entitlements of Medicare and Medicaid, and the what you'd have to say the enhancement of Social Security. What would Mr. Lincoln make of that today?
Well, I have a little dollop of modesty here because it's 150 years later, and this is the major innovation in American government. So maybe under the pressure of events and the Great Depression, he becomes an FDR liberal. Who knows? But if you just take what he said and believed and assume no change of point of view, he would reject the redistributionism of the welfare state. Whig economics was very much a non-zero kind of economics. They believed in our cliche of the day that a rising tide lifts all boats. Lincoln tells a delegation of working men who comes to visit him in the White House during the Civil War, let not him who was houseless pull down the house of another, but labor diligently to build one of his own. He said he was against any sort of law to keep people from getting rich because it would do more harm than good, and people getting rich was a good example for other people coming up behind him. And I have a hard time seeing him being able to stomach government payments to people for not working. And we discussed earlier just how excoriating he was to his stepbrother, who he believed wasn't working hard enough and was just asking for a loan. You can imagine his reaction if stepbrother was living off of the proceeds of other people's labor.
At the same time, 1965 is the Voting Rights Act, which is a continuation and a correction and an enhancement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Mr. Lincoln is completely identified with the Civil War fought to end slavery. But here we are in the 21st century, and we have to not just ask about slavery, but we ask about labor. What Mr. Lincoln faulted about slavery was that you weren't paid for your work. How would he regard paying people for not working today, or for what you point to is the incredible and so far unexplained rise in Social Security disability payments to young working-age people?
I believe he'd be appalled by it because striving was so important to him. He repeatedly used the phrase, such a Lincolnian phrase, the race of life. And in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he said one of the reasons he hated slavery, I'll clean up the language a little bit, was that it takes away from the African-American the right to strive to be a man. And that's such a Lincolnian sentiment. It's in the striving. It's in the effort that we make ourselves men and we make ourselves women. So he would be appalled by any system, I believe, that chipped away at the work ethic the way the contemporary welfare state does today.
The family. Mr. Lincoln was not a pop psychologist. However, he did emphasize his own education, and he used a couple of textbooks. He self-taught himself, and he was very happy, and Rich points out to the fact that he even boasted of sending his son to college, to Harvard College, Robert Lincoln, who becomes a valued member of subsequent administrations and could have run for president. He was nominated, at least on the floor of the GOP convention, several times in the late 19th century. But I want to go to the family and the primers that he read. What did that do for Mr. Lincoln, and what would he have made of our valueless education today?
These primers, it's really heartbreaking, John, to look back at what their contents were. These are very basic school books that every kid who was getting an education read. And they had the very excerpts from the very best in literature, the very best in speeches throughout American history. They provided a moral education as well as a literary education. And although Lincoln was self-taught, what was he self-taught with? The Bible, with Shakespeare, with these primers. He loved poetry. And that's how you get this guy from such a common background, with just a year or two formal schooling, who still couldn't spell a lot of basic words, even when he was president, but who has such a great sense of the musicality of words. And when you take that sense and you join it to its higher purpose, which goes back to our founding ideals, and you do it in the dramatic circumstances of the Civil War, that's when you get these speeches and these state papers that will echo down through the ages.
You mentioned the founders, Rich, and it is striking to see that Mr. Lincoln did not look to Lincoln because he wasn't available, did not even look to Jefferson, who was the revolutionary thinker, to my reading, or his friend Mr. Madison. He looked to Washington. Why Washington, and what can we learn from that, Rich?
Well, he revered Washington. There's a famous passage in one of his early speeches where he says that no one could add to the memory of Washington. It just has to live in naked, deathless splendor. But he did, the most important founding document to him was the Declaration. And he had a problem with Jefferson's economics. He thought Jefferson overly romanticized agriculture, which Lincoln had no use for after his youth. But he loved the Declaration. And if you read Lincoln's speeches and his rhetoric in the 1850s, it's suffused with a sense of loss because he believes the founders tolerated slavery, but they are embarrassed by slavery, and they thought eventually it would go away, which is why they don't use the word slavery in the Constitution. And in the 1850s in the South, you saw a different attitude rising up, a more positive defense of slavery. Slavery is supposedly an institution from God. It's good for the slaves. It's good for the rest of society. And for Lincoln, this was shameful national backsliding. And he said the entire purpose of the Declaration, it could have just been a catalog of our abuses at the hands of the British. Instead, there's that philosophical guidepost that is hammered into the ground for all time in the preamble of the Declaration, and he constantly called us back to it. And these, they're gorgeous passages in these speeches where he says things like, "Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us repurify and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the Revolution." And that was ultimately his project, and I think should always be the American project. How do you forge progress and enhance opportunity? By going back through our founding ideals.
Now, for an editor, the art of persuasion. Let's go to that part, Rich. Of all the things we can celebrate, rather than do tax reform, which of course is rational, but we're not going to plunge into it, this phrase you used that Lincoln liked, that you can get a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. What does that mean for Mr. Lincoln, and how does that translate today to your work, Rich?
Yeah, well, he was not true to this admonition initially as a young man, as a young politician. He was a slashing partisan. He made famously people cry on the stage with him by ridiculing them and abusing them. He almost fought a duel. But then over time, the edges were the rough edges were smoothed over, and just you can't be denunciatory or intentionally inflammatory if you want to convince people of anything. And you only win in American politics by convincing people. Ronald Reagan, I believe, is another great example of this. Conservatives now, we all celebrate Reagan Democrats. Well, what were they before they were Reagan Democrats? They were just Democrats. And Reagan did something to meet them in the place where they were and to win them over. And that's what any great politician does. And another great commonality of statesmanship between Lincoln and Reagan, and really any great statesman, is having that ultimate fixed, principled end, but being very shrewd and very tactical in how you get there.
And the politicians today, they could learn from Mr. Lincoln that you can't kick them to you. Is that another way to interpret this?
Exactly. Now, look, there are always going to be, especially in Congress, especially among backbenchers, types who do not take this lesson on. And Lincoln had them in his own age, the radical Republicans there in Congress. He called them devils facing Zionward, which meant that he was they're very fiendish to deal with, but they are ultimately heading in the right direction. And if you actually look at Lincoln's progress on the issue of emancipating the slaves, the radical Republicans were always one step ahead of him. So there is something to be said for stubborn, principled, obnoxious politicians who don't want to give an inch. There's always a place for them. They can help lead the way, but ultimately you need a statesman who is, as I say, is willing to be flexible in how to get there and not give the game away and sort of suicidal tactical extravagance.
Rich Lowry, the editor of the National Review Online, his new book is Lincoln Unbound, How an Ambitious Young Railsplitter Saved the American Dream and